Hello, this is Gene with Retrofix Games, bringing a very niche piece of content, to be honest. I wanted to talk about a cool handheld. No, not that one, although we'll get there. I wanted to talk about the Wonderswan. It was exclusively for the Japanese market. It was developed by Gunpei Yokoi. It used a single AA battery housed in the battery door. The cartridges had a bajillion and two exposed pins. Not my favorite design, but I get it. And for whatever reason, they decided to do the Apple thing before Apple did. The sound button is either no sound, a lot of sound, or some sound. Not exactly ideal if you're sitting on the train, which is weird because Gunpei Yokoi first developed the Game & Watch with salarymen on the train in mind. So I don't know if it's just because as he progressed along, he probably didn't have to take the train quite so much, or if it was just a misstep in the favor of a sleek design. This is the last game I was playing on here. It is a Japanese pro wrestling game. I cannot pronounce the title for you. I'm very sorry. But because it was developed exclusively for the Japanese market, a lot of very Japanese market-driven design incentives were put into this. Like the fact that it can be played in both landscape mode and tate, or portrait mode, which meant that it had a lot of heavy reading games. Your visual novels and horror games. Speaking of horror games, one of the things that Bandai Namco, the folks that commissioned this from Mr. Gunpei Yokoi, they had a lot of anime licenses. And so we saw a couple of horror games by Junji Ito. We saw some of their other licensed properties like Klonoa. And we saw some children's Saturday morning anime like Metabots. Maybe not stuff that like everyone in the States is going to recognize, but at least stuff that's going to ring a bell for some of you. It's just really interesting that they developed this console, again, for a market that we here in the States just do not think about that much. Like the fact that it has a port to plug into a Japanese cell phone. The original black and white Wonderswan, released in 1999, had the ability to use their internet. We wouldn't see that until the Game Boy, the Nintendo DS, not the Game Boy DS, the Nintendo DS. So it was really ahead of its time in some ways. In spite of being a black screen, single batteried, very low key profile, you can see where it came from, and it makes sense that Gunpei Yokoi would make it, because the last thing he made for them was an update to the Game Boy Pocket, which of course used 2 AAAs, and was overall slimmer and more compact version of the original Game Boy. After he left the company, he was offered a job at Bandai to design their new handheld, something to compete with the Nintendo. And so he did so. But right before that came out, a mere 4 months before, the Game Boy Color was released. Still used 2 batteries, but it used nicer cartridges, higher def graphics, and it was in color. Nintendo finally made the leap to color in 1998. And so, without Mr. Yokoi to guide them, because he passed away right before the release of the console, they were left wondering what to do. And so they immediately worked on releasing a color version of the Wonderswan, the Wonderswan Color. I do not have one of those, unfortunately, because they're a little hard to come by in good condition. That's probably the polite way to say it. They didn't hold up well. It does feel like they were a little rushed. However, they produced a prolific amount of games for the Color, which I do have. They were able to get some licensing from Squaresoft. So some of the first re-releases of the original Final Fantasy games came out on this little handheld. They didn't do any of this for Nintendo until the Game Boy Advance years later. This was kind of when they were not on the outs with Nintendo, but they definitely had a strained relationship. It's part of the reason they made the jump to PlayStation. They released all sorts of quirky puzzle games that I find the art for very charming. And they continued to lean on their massive anime properties with Inuyasha and Shaman King. And then for olds like me, Star Blazers or Space Battleship Yamato. So, a pretty healthy amount of stuff. Lots and lots of games. And it played all of the black and white games. It did not colorize them in the way that the Game Boy Color and the Advance did. Maybe a misstep. Hard to say. I didn't really use the color upscale function on my Nintendo games. So, I don't know. Maybe I'm weird. And then a year after that, in 2002, they came out with the Wonderswan Crystal. Except that, again, they were beaten to the punch by the Game Boy Advance. Now, this is much smaller than the Game Boy Advance, and it was cheaper at the time of release. So, it had some things going for it that allowed it to stay in the market. But ultimately, in 2003, they ceased production and stopped supporting the console. But again, they had a healthy stock of anime licenses, which at the time, if you were going to make an anime game, it's got to be One Piece. That was the biggest thing ever at the time. Still is in some areas. They did still go with a single battery, but it has a locking function so that you don't accidentally lose this. Smart, and a simple mechanical solution to their problem of if you lose this, you've damaged the entire console. Cartridges went from a standard black to a clear, which makes sense as branding for the Wonderswan Crystal. It still has a sound button instead of something you can dial in the sound on, or a headphone jack of any kind. They sell an adapter for this. It only comes with certain games, which makes those games very expensive now, so I don't have one. I'm not typically playing this on the train or anything, so it works. They did do away with the power switch and went with a button. It's a little mushy, so I wish they had stuck with the switch, but I'm sure this was a cost-cutting measure and a way to make the board easier to solder everything to. But they continued to lean into their anime properties. Things look pretty good. It's a real competitor to the Game Boy Advance that came out in 2001. So again, they were beaten to the punch with their big upgrade. I do not think the Wonderswan Color could really match up against the Game Boy Advance. And I mean, one was Color and one wasn't. The original Wonderswan had an uphill battle going up against the Game Boy Color. At the time, they did their best. They had some really interesting games that we may never see again. Like, that Klonoa is a unique game. And I don't know if we'll ever see it reproduced for any kind of collection or thing like that. Those Junji Ito games, basically lost media as far as here goes. So unless you can speak Japanese, you don't get to play these weird games he made. If you're a super big fan of an anime property, they made a game for it probably. And we don't get to play it because it never came here. So unless Nintendo or somebody decides to buy and showcase that library on one of their services, there's a good chance that the only way to play this is to try and track it down on eBay and fight everyone else for it, which is unfortunate. I think it's a shame that this is the last thing that Gunpei Yokoi made, and most people don't even realize it exists. I think it had a much better shot of making it in the American market than the Neo Geo Pocket Color did, and that came to the States. So I would have liked to have seen how it would have done in some alternate timeline where we got this. I remember hearing about it when I was in high school, and being a weird nerd, I wanted one. And when I became an adult and could just buy things, I did. I bought one. The only reason I haven't bought a game or a color for it is one, the color games play on the Crystal. So as far as playability, I have all the consoles I need. And two, again, finding a Wonderswan color that is in good enough shape that I want it is hard. it was the middle child. It really only had a release period of 2 years before it was replaced by the Crystal. And I just don't know if enough of them were bought that they're still hanging around in good shape. And if I'm going to break down and buy one, it's going to be a collectible one. I'm going to want a weird mint in box one to sit on a shelf. Because again, I can just play everything on this one. And I like the novelty of the original one. It's also really, really small. So it's convenient for portability's sake. Anyway, I hope you really enjoyed this very niche piece of content. I'm always excited to talk about weird consoles like this. Maybe we'll do something again if you guys like it. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.